In the early morning hours of September 15, 1983, in the restless heart of New York City, a young man named Michael Jerome Stewart was on his way home. He was 25 years old, an aspiring artist, a model, a dreamer. A native of Brooklyn, Michael was soft-spoken, charismatic, and hopeful. Friends described him as someone who smiled easily, who saw art in everything, and who never let the harshness of city life harden him. He had been out that night with friends in Manhattan's East Village, soaking in the culture and energy of a city pulsing with creative revolution. At approximately 2:45 a.m., Michael was arrested at the First Avenue L train station. The charge? Allegedly writing graffiti, just 3 letters on a subway wall with a marker. A minor offense, even by the standards of the 1980s graffiti wave. Witnesses at the scene later recalled that Michael didn't resist arrest. He was handcuffed without incident, his head down, cooperating. 2 New York City Transit police officers escorted him to a holding area. What happened next would be shrouded in mystery, clouded by official denials, and ultimately would ignite a firestorm of outrage. Just 45 minutes after his arrest, Michael Stewart arrived at Bellevue Hospital. He was unconscious. His face was battered, swollen beyond recognition. There were lacerations, bruises, and broken bones. Medical staff said it looked like he had been used to mopping the floor. A nurse later testified she overheard one officer casually say, "We gave him a good tune-up." At that moment, Michael was in a coma. 12 days later, he was dead. To understand the horror of what happened, you have to look deeper. Not just at the injuries, but at the story told to explain them. According to the officers involved, Michael had become violent in custody. They claimed he was acting erratically, screaming, kicking, throwing himself against walls. They described him as out of control, potentially under the influence of drugs. They said they had to physically restrain him using what they referred to as reasonable force. But there was no body cam footage, no surveillance video, just their word, and a young black man who couldn't speak for himself. The story didn't hold up for long. The autopsy revealed that Michael had suffered a severe spinal cord injury. His neck was broken, specifically the second cervical vertebra had been crushed. He had hemorrhaging in both eyes, consistent with asphyxiation. There were signs that he had been choked or had pressure applied to his neck. But what was perhaps most telling of all, there was no evidence that he had drowned in his own vomit or had any drugs or alcohol in his system, despite police claims. Medical examiners stated that the injuries were not consistent with someone who simply collapsed or had a seizure. They were consistent with someone who had been forcefully restrained, silenced, possibly suffocated. In the following days, a second and third independent autopsy were ordered. Each one returned a different result. One said cardiac arrest, another said blunt force trauma, a third labeled the cause of death undetermined. That word, undetermined, became a shield, one the police, the city, and the justice system used to defend inaction. The public, however, was not so easily convinced. As news of Michael Stewart's death spread, anger boiled over. The black community had seen this play out before. A young black man dies in police custody, and no one is held accountable. It was a pattern that was as familiar as it was devastating. Michael wasn't the first, but he had to be the last, people said. Artists rallied to his side. Jean-Michel Basquiat created works in his honor. Keith Haring held fundraisers. Musicians like Madonna and Africa Bambaataa performed at benefit concerts to raise legal funds for his family. Civil rights leaders joined protests. And still, the system stalled. The first grand jury convened to look into the case returned no indictments. Nothing. Not one charge. Not even misconduct. The officers claimed Michael had gone berserk, and the jury believed them. To the community, it felt like a slap in the face. "He walked into that subway station," said his mother, Carrie Stewart, "and he never walked out. That's not a story of resistance. That's a story of murder." The outrage became impossible to ignore. 2 years after Michael's death, and only after intense public scrutiny, 6 officers were finally indicted. Their names were released. Their actions were investigated. The courtroom was filled with press and protesters. But the trial became a battle of conflicting narratives. The defense painted Michael as erratic, dangerous, possibly on drugs. Despite toxicology results showing nothing in his system, they floated the theory of excited delirium, a vague and often racially charged concept used to justify deaths during restraint. They brought in their own experts. They cast doubt on the autopsy findings. The prosecution, on the other hand, had the medical reports, the witness testimonies, and the body itself, covered in injuries that spoke louder than words. Yet on November 24, 1985, after weeks of testimony and years of waiting, all 6 officers were acquitted. Not guilty. All of them. There were gasps in the courtroom. Carrie Stewart collapsed into the arms of her relatives. Reporters described the scene as one of devastation. Another wound ripped open for a community that had hoped, for once, that justice might prevail. But the story didn't end there. The Stewart family filed a civil suit against the city. In 1990, they reached a settlement, $1.7 million. It was one of the largest of its kind at the time. The city paid but never admitted wrongdoing. The officers went back to their jobs. And Michael was buried. But something had shifted. Michael Stewart became a symbol. A name chanted at protests, scrawled on murals, whispered in civil rights circles. His death forced reforms within the NYPD's transit division. It led to renewed conversations about police accountability. And decades later, when George Floyd cried, "I can't breathe," and the world erupted in protest, some remembered that Michael had said those words too, long before cameras were rolling. In fact, Michael Stewart was one of the first recorded cases where a black man in police custody had died from asphyxiation caused by a chokehold, years before the infamous LAPD beating of Rodney King, and long before the names Eric Garner, Elijah McClain, or Tyre Nichols made headlines. His story, tragic and eerily familiar, became a warning, a blueprint, a signal flare that was ignored. It's the irony that cuts deepest, that Michael, an artist obsessed with expression, would have his voice violently taken. That his final act, allegedly writing graffiti, was an expression of identity, now erased by a justice system that refused to see it. That his body became the battleground for a war between truth and power. And that the truth, though buried, never stopped fighting to be heard. Today, his name is not as widely known as it should be. There's no Hollywood film, no national holiday, but in the art circles of New York, in the hearts of activists, and in the chants of those still marching for justice, Michael Stewart lives on. The real tragedy? His death could have been prevented. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't violent. He didn't deserve to die. He deserved to go home. He deserved to finish his sketchbook. He deserved to live. So when we tell his story today, we do so not just to mourn, but to remember. Because every time another headline flashes across the screen with a familiar script, a black man, a minor offense, police custody, sudden death, we are reminded that justice isn't always served in the courtroom. Sometimes justice is in the telling, in the remembering, in refusing to let names like Michael Stewart fade into silence. Because silence is how injustice survives. And stories? Stories are how we fight back. If the story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Speak it. Say his name, Michael Stewart. Like, subscribe, and help us keep the truth alive. One story at a time. Thank you for watching.